There is a man walking around France today, perhaps in Paris, or maybe sunbathing on a beach in Nice, who carries a silent testament to his own arrogance, permanently etched into his skin. He is likely in his late 50s now. He probably still takes off his shirt with a sense of pride, completely unaware that for 30 years he has been walking around branded with a phrase that makes every Mandarin speaker who crosses his path stifle a laugh. He paid for that brand. In fact, he practically begged me for it. But to understand how we both ended up in that room and why I chose to play the silent executioner of his reputation, we have to go back to the autumn of 1996. Back then, I was a 24-year-old kid from Jakarta, backpacking solo across a Europe that still felt incredibly vast and disconnected. There were no smartphones, no translation apps, and very few travelers who looked like me in the northern corners. It was a lonely, beautiful journey, and in every country I visited, I had a quiet tradition. I would find a local tattoo parlor and get a small, simple symbol to mark the chapter. By October, I found myself in Helsinki. The parlor I chose was tucked away in a damp basement, smelling heavily of rubbing alcohol and stale tobacco. The artist was a quiet, heavily tattooed Finn whose stoic silence matched the freezing rain outside. I was sitting in the corner, waiting my turn to get a small Finnish flag on my shoulder, enjoying the warmth of the radiator. Then the door flew open, and the quiet sanctuary of the studio was instantly shattered. They were tourists from France, and they carried themselves with the kind of aggressive entitlement that immediately sucks the oxygen out of a room. They didn't greet the artist. Instead, the louder of the two marched straight to the counter. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp jawline and cold eyes, tapping his fingers impatiently. I watched the tattoo artist. His shoulders tensed, and his fingers tightened around his stencil pen until his knuckles turned white. He was in the middle of preparing a delicate design, but these men didn't care. They spoke French to each other, tossing casual, mocking glances at the art on the walls, and then spoke to the artist in broken English. They demanded immediate attention, as if their time was infinitely more valuable than anyone else's in that room. Psychologists often talk about projection, the human tendency to assume everyone else shares your moral compass. But there is another side to it. The arrogant assume that those who are quiet are also powerless. They treat the world as their personal stage, and everyone else as mere stagehands. As I sat there, listening to them bark orders at the patient artist, I felt a familiar cold knot form in my chest. I knew their type, and I knew that direct confrontation would only feed their drama. I didn't know it yet, but the tall one was about to make the biggest mistake of his life by looking in my direction. "Hey," the tall one said, his voice dripping with an easy, unearned familiarity. He didn't ask if he could sit. He simply leaned against the wooden partition next to my chair, crossing his arms. You Chinese, right? I looked up at him. In his eyes, I didn't see genuine curiosity. I saw the lazy, exoticizing gaze of someone who viewed the rest of the world as a background set for his own adventure. My family is, I replied, keeping my voice flat, polite, and entirely unbothered. Perfect, he said, snapping his fingers as if he had just solved a minor inconvenience. Listen, my friend is getting his arm done, but I want something different. Something with some real soul, you know? I've always wanted a Chinese character. Something deep. What's the word for love? Or like eternal passion? Write it down for me. It was a fascinating psychological display. He didn't care about the history or the brush strokes. To him, my heritage was just a commodity, a cool aesthetic he could wear to look sensitive and profound at parties back in Paris. He was treating me like a free translation service, confident that I would be eager to please him, simply because he had deigned to ask. In that moment, I had two choices. I could refuse, which would likely result in an awkward argument. Or I could give him exactly what his arrogance deserved. I chose the latter. Of course, I said, offering him a warm, cooperative smile that reached my eyes but went no further. I can do that for you. I turned to a fresh, blank page. I didn't write the character for love. A beautiful, complex character containing the radical for heart. Instead, I let my hand glide across the paper, drawing two entirely different symbols with deliberate, steady strokes. The first character I wrote was Sha. It means foolish, simple-minded, or idiotic. The second character was B. It is an incredibly vulgar, ancient piece of Mandarin slang referring to female anatomy. Together, they form Sha-B. It is perhaps the most visceral, cutting, and universally understood insult in the Chinese language. It roughly translates to stupid cunt. I tore the slip of paper from my journal and handed it to him. Here, I whispered, keeping my face entirely serene. This is what you are looking for. He took the paper, holding it up to the light, squinting at the sharp angles of the characters, as if he could somehow decipher their meaning through sheer force of will. What does it translate to, exactly? He asked, a sudden touch of suspicion in his voice. I looked him straight in the eyes, my expression a masterpiece of sincere, quiet reverence. It is an older, more classical interpretation. I lied smoothly. It doesn't just mean simple love. It refers to a passion so intense, so primal, that it completely consumes the mind. A love that makes you foolish. It is a warrior's devotion. The tourist's face softened. A slow, proud grin spread across his lips. Beautiful, he muttered. That's exactly what I wanted. The tourist didn't waste a single second. He marched over to the tattoo artist, waving my scrap of paper in the air like a trophy. "Hey, change of plans," he announced, tapping his shoulder blade. "Forget the tribal piece. Put this on me instead, right here. Let's do it now." The Finnish artist took the paper. He looked at the characters, his face expressionless. He was a professional, but he was also a man who had spent the last 2 hours being treated like an invisible servant by these two men. Slowly, his gaze drifted past the tourist's shoulder and met mine. We locked eyes. I didn't say a word. I didn't smile. I simply gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. The artist looked back down at the paper, then at the loud, boastful Frenchman. A subtle, almost invisible shadow of a smile played at the corner of the Finn's mouth. He didn't ask questions. He didn't double-check. Whether he guessed the truth or simply decided that these men had earned whatever was coming to them, he simply reached for his ink caps. "Sit," the artist said, his voice flat. As the needle tore into his skin, the tourist's arrogant posture shattered. He caught his breath, his eyes widening in sudden shock, his fingers digging deep into the vinyl of the chair. But his friend was watching, and his pride wouldn't let him show weakness. He forced a grimace into a tight, strained smile, gritting his teeth as the black ink was driven deep into his dermis. I sat there and watched the entire process in quiet fascination. With every stroke, the joke became more permanent. I watched the curves of the character Shah take shape, followed by the heavy, vulgar complexity of B. It was a strange, almost meditative experience. In a world where the loud and aggressive so often override the quiet, this was a rare moment of absolute poetic balance. No voice was raised. No blood was spilled in anger. There was no hacking, no fraud, and no laws broken. Just a quiet alignment of arrogance and consequence. It took about 45 minutes. When the artist finally switched off the machine, the sudden silence in the room was deafening. The artist cleaned the area with green soap, slapped a layer of petroleum jelly over the fresh wound, and taped a piece of plastic wrap over it. The tourist stood up, wincing, and walked over to the mirror. He turned his shoulder, trying to look at his own back, his face glowing with a mixture of relief and intense, self-satisfied pride. "Man, that looks sharp," his friend said, clapping him on the shoulder, making him wince again. "Very authentic." "Yeah," the tall one agreed, running his hand over the plastic wrap. He turned to me and gave me a thumbs up. "Thanks, mate. Appreciate the help." "My pleasure," I said softly. "Wear it with pride." When the door closed behind them, the air in the studio seemed to clear instantly. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of their arrogance vanished, replaced by the familiar, sterile smell of green soap and the quiet warmth of the radiator. The tattoo artist stood by his counter for a long moment, slowly wrapping his cord. He didn't say anything. He didn't laugh. But as he looked over at me, the corners of his eyes crinkled. He picked up a fresh needle cartridge, tore open the packaging, and gestured toward the empty chair. "Your turn," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, but it carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. As the needle began its work, tracing the clean, straight lines of a small blue and white Finnish flag on my shoulder, I felt a deep, quiet sense of peace. It didn't hurt. After what I had just witnessed, the bite of the needle felt incredibly clean. It felt like a boundary being drawn, a small, permanent anchor keeping me grounded in a world that often felt far too vast and unpredictable. "They will never forget Finland," he muttered quietly. I smiled, slipping my shirt back on. "No, I don't think they will." Looking back on that cold October night in 1996, I realized that life has a strange, quiet way of balancing the scales. Arrogance is a slow-acting poison. It makes people blind. It makes them believe they can take whatever they want, other people's space, other people's dignity, and even other people's languages, and walk away completely untouched. They assume that because they are loud, they are in control. But the universe doesn't always correct the balance with a dramatic explosion or a public downfall. Sometimes justice is delivered with a quiet ballpoint pen, a scrap of paper, and 2 permanent characters on a shoulder blade. I still wonder about that man sometimes. I wonder if he ever walked into a Chinese restaurant in Paris, pulled back his collar to show off his deep warrior love, and watched the waiter's face turn pale before they hurried back to the kitchen to laugh. I wonder if he ever met someone who had the courage to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what he was carrying. Part of me hopes he did, but even if he didn't, the mark is still there. A permanent, silent joke etched into his skin, a badge of his own entitlement that he wears every single day. But as I've grown older, I've learned that the most dangerous marks aren't the ones written in black ink on our skin. The most dangerous marks are the ones left deep within our minds, carved in silence by the very people who were supposed to protect us. Because sometimes the tyrants we have to face aren't rude tourists in a foreign country. Sometimes they are the ones we share a home with, the ones whose footsteps down the hallway can make you hold your breath, and whose bitter, toxic poison can take an entire lifetime to wash off. If you want to see what happens when a master manipulator, a mother who ruled her household like a tyrant, finally pushed her family too far, only to find herself staring down the barrel of a 911 call she never saw coming, click on the video on your screen right now. You won't regret watching it. I'll see you there.